A young recruit picks up his new uniform for the first time, only to find another man's name etched into the collar the very next second.
Entschuldigung, die gehört schon wem?
War ihr wohl zu klein für den Kerl, ne? Da kommt immer wieder vor. Hier, macht J.
While the kid swallows the quartermaster's explanation hook, line, and sinker, he's blissfully unaware that every single one of these uniforms has been through the ringer countless times. The name tag reads Heinrich, and just a few days ago, this guy was also a fresh-faced recruit starting his journey. Since the outbreak of World War I, the Western Front bordering Germany and France has been the most intense, serving as the primary meat grinder with the highest casualties and most persistent conflict. A few days back, Heinrich was just a spirited German youth, but now he's charging through a battlefield literally paved with bodies. Like every other greenhorn, Heinrich lacks any real combat skills and can't even tell friend from foe in the heat of his first battle, eventually blowing through all his ammo and being forced to fight for his life with an entrenching tool. Amidst the endless barrage and the screams of the dying, Heinrich swings his last blow with everything he's got. With zero suspense, he becomes just another statistic in the endless wave of German soldiers who have been unalived. Soon after, his clothes and boots are stripped from his body, ready to be sorted and stored by someone specifically assigned to the task. Those bodies that can't be processed are tossed into makeshift coffins and buried right there on the battlefield. Finally, those recycled clothes and boots are patched up, making these brand new uniforms ready for the next round of use. And it's right here that the main story actually kicks off. By the spring of 1917, 3 years into the World War, the conflict is reaching a pivotal turning point. Compared to the bloody and chaotic front lines, the streets of Germany still look pristine and clean. Our protagonist, Paul, arrives at the military academy beaming with pride, where his 3 best friends, Ludwig, Albert, and Franz, are already waiting for him. They're all in high spirits today because they've finally been cleared for enlistment. Inside the massive assembly hall, the young students hang on every word of their principal's lecture. Standing front and center, the man is a total silver-tongued devil, screaming at the top of his lungs to incite extreme chauvinism while painting blatant aggression as nothing more than patriotic fervor.
Auf in den Kampf! Für Kaiser, Gott und Vaterland! Yeah!
The intense rhetoric and the thick atmosphere of nationalism send the entire hall into a fever pitch. Next up, everyone starts lining up for their uniforms. Standing in line, Paul can hardly contain his excitement as he waits for his turn. After a quick ID check, the quartermaster hands him a fresh set of gear. Paul takes a few steps away, but immediately notices someone else's name on the collar, rushing back to ask what's up, though the quartermaster's explanation is smooth as silk. Once Paul leaves satisfied, the quartermaster habitually tosses the stray tag onto the floor. That tag bears the name Heinrich. The 4 boys are absolutely stoked with their gear. Ludwig tries on a new pair of glasses from his mom, Franz thinks he looks sharp as hell in the uniform, and Albert gets a bit vain while fixing his hair. Paul is the only steady one, simply standing there with a goofy grin on his face. Following a brief enlistment process, Paul and his buddies officially join the ranks as they had hoped. Carrying their sense of glory and singing war songs, they have no clue how brutal the upcoming battlefield really is. Not long after, the unit arrives at La Malmaison in northern France, which is still about 25 kilometers away from the Western Front. However, a combat medic at the supply station flags down their truck because 40 wounded soldiers desperately need the transport, meaning our boys have to hoof it for the rest of the way. A few dozen kilometers might be a breeze for the veterans, but for these rookies, the trek is already turning into a nightmare.
Wollen Sie in 6 Wochen noch leben?
Jawohl.
Nehmen Sie gefälligst die Beine in die Hand und trödeln nicht so herum! Haben Sie mich verstanden?
Ja.
No sooner are the words out of their mouths than a few enemy shells come crashing down. The officer screams that it's gas, immediately ordering everyone to don their masks. Because he stops to help Ludwig out, Paul falls behind and ends up at the back of the pack. The officer marches over and lays into Paul for being too slow, punishing him by forcing him to wear the mask for the rest of the march. By nightfall, the unit finally reaches the frontline trenches. The rain is pouring down as veterans grip their machine guns, spraying lead into the darkness ahead. The moment they stop, an officer helps Paul pull off his mask, and the sudden rush of fresh air feels like a godsend as his body finally begins to relax. A veteran named Kat approaches Paul and kindly offers him a canteen. Without much chatter, Everyone is expected to adapt to the rhythm of this place immediately. Their first task is to bail the rainwater out of the trenches, and the rookies follow suit, using their helmets as buckets. Ludwig cries out that this isn't at all what he signed up for, while the others complain that their hands have gone completely numb from the cold. Kat steps in again, telling the group that shoving their hands into their crotches is the quickest way to get some warmth back. The trick actually works, and for a moment, it stops their hands from shaking like leaves. Right now, these 4 young men feel like they finally understand what war is, but the true horror is still waiting for them, just over the ridge. That night, the battlefield is eerily quiet, as if both sides have reached an unspoken agreement to take a breather. It's the first watch for Albert and Paul, and since they have 0 combat experience, they just keep their eyes peeled on the darkness ahead. Just then, a strange noise echoes through the air, and Paul pulls the trigger on pure instinct. Paul is scared out of his wits when a return shot rings out, but luckily, it only grazes his helmet. Hearing the commotion, Kat walks over and schools them on not firing so easily, reminding them that even if they do shoot, they can't afford to stay in the same spot. At midnight, a flare suddenly tears through the sky, followed by a massive, crushing artillery barrage. Led by the veterans, everyone huddles in the deepest part of the trench to ride out the danger. The violent thunder and shaking of the earth have a terrified Ludwig clinging to Paul for dear life. As the shelling finally starts to taper off, a veteran named Tjaden explains that the bombardment is just to clear the path, and the French infantry will be hot on its heels. Before the words even settle, the entire trench begins to shudder once more. The following morning, Paul is pulled from the wreckage by his comrades. He is incredibly lucky to have walked away with his life. Staring at the smoke-filled battlefield, one can only imagine how intense yesterday's fighting truly was. As Paul walks into the decimated trench, he finds Kat eating, who hands him a piece of bread that feels more precious than gold in this wasteland. Just then, an officer tosses over a bag, ordering Paul to start collecting the dog tags of their fallen brothers. After a brief moment to catch his breath, Paul takes the bag and begins his grim assignment. Every soldier carries a tag etched with their service number, blood type, and unit code or regiment number. Once a soldier is unalived, the unit snaps the tag in half along the groove, leaving one half with the body, while the other is sent back for filing to confirm their identity and notify the family. After only a few steps, Paul feels something crunch under his boot, and picking it up for a closer look, he realizes it is Ludwig's glasses. In an instant, a sickening sense of dread washes over him as he wonders if something has happened to his friend. Scanning the area, a familiar silhouette inevitably appears just ahead. Paul rolls the body over to check, and it is indeed his dear friend, Ludwig. Enduring a heart-wrenching sorrow, Paul removes the dog tag and gently straightens the boy's collar one last time. In a single day and night, the lofty ideals Paul once held are ground into dust. His patriotic fervor completely vanished and replaced by the sheer horror of war and a literal sea of corpses. 18 months later, the collected dog tags are delivered to the German High Command. Holding stacks of lists naming the fallen, government officials confront the military elite. With just a single glance, the casualty numbers are enough to make anyone's blood run cold, and they realize that if the war doesn't stop, Germany will completely exhaust its resources and run out of men to fight. Meanwhile, in the German-occupied Champagne region of France, a now hardened Paul stares blankly into the distance. Today, he and Kat are planning to pull off something big. Leaving their transport behind, the two of them head straight for a nearby farmhouse. It turns out they intend to sneak inside and snatch a goose to finally get a decent meal. After scouting the area, they find the place quiet and seemingly empty. Kat takes charge of the theft, while Paul stays outside to keep watch. Soon, a dog in the yard begins to bark frantically, making Paul realize the farmer has spotted them. And as he turns to check the door, Kat bursts out clutching a massive goose. The farmer is a terrible shot, firing multiple rounds without hitting either of them. This brief moment of chaos and narrow escape feels like an absolute luxury in the middle of a brutal war. Back at the base, Tjaden proves his cooking skills are top-notch as the fragrant roasted goose is served. Beside Paul and Kat, Albert and Franz also get a share of the prize. The 5 of them eat with gusto, their laughter and joy marking a memory that time will surely preserve as a highlight of their lives. By this point, the war that has raged for 4 long years is finally nearing its end. Due to the rotation of frontline duties, the group has managed to land a relatively cushy job in logistics. Kat is quite the talker, sharing stories of his life before the army, making their former lives feel like nothing but a distant dream. During their chat, 3 local girls pass by, and Albert is the first to jump up and say hello, while Franz quickly smooths down his hair. Unlike the hesitant Albert, Franz takes the lead and runs over, quickly hitting it off with the girls. Though Albert is green with envy, he never quite finds the courage to make a move. The remaining men continue their idle talk, with Kat fiddling with a beetle as he speaks, treating the insect as a sort of spiritual anchor in the chaos of war. Tjaden is the practical one, planning to become a local gendarme after the war so he can live out his days in peace with his family. That night, Franz quietly slips back into the barracks. Paul tells him to get some shut-eye because they have a search mission to carry out early the next morning. Franz seems a bit buzzed, revealing that he didn't just spend time with the girls, but even managed to snag one of their silk scarves before leaving. Paul holds it to his nose and inhales, the indescribable fragrance providing a momentary escape for the soul. Early the next morning, Kat leads Paul and the others out to execute their mission. Compared to the constant shelling of the front lines, the enemies remaining in the occupied zones are mostly just deserters. Through their briefing, they learn that 60 new recruits retreated from the battlefield yesterday, but have since gone missing without a trace. Soon after, they arrive at a derelict train station where the ground is littered with a massive amount of spent gas canisters. This sight gives Kat a bad feeling, and he orders everyone to fan out, fearing the missing recruits might have already met their end. During the search, Albert slips away from the group to find some water, only to be surprised by a poster of a beautiful woman. He walks up to it slowly and extends a gentlemanly invitation to the image. Then, Albert draws his combat knife and carefully cuts the portrait out to take with him. On the other side of the site, Paul enters a massive warehouse. Walking through a long, cluttered corridor, he pushes open a door that had been left slightly ajar at the end. The room is filled with soldiers lying silently, but not a single one of them is still breathing. The experienced Kat knows instantly that these recruits were too quick to strip off their gas masks, resulting in them being unalived by the lingering pockets of poison gas. One night, Paul is jolted awake from his sleep. It turns out an order has just come down from the front, and it's finally their turn to head back into the thick of the fighting. As the sky begins to gray at dawn, the unit reaches the forward positions of the Western Front. The trenches are familiar, the environment is familiar, and a brand new round of tragic slaughter is about to kick off. Before the battle begins, Albert pulls out that poster of the woman and hangs it up right beside him. Paul remains silent as he finally understands what war truly is, and today, whether he makes it out alive is still anyone's guess. The officer reluctantly hangs up the phone from his superiors, knowing full well that a massive number of soldiers are about to lose their lives right here. The moment the command is barked out, every soldier levels their rifle and charges headlong into the fray. Caught in the middle of the crowd, Paul moves mechanically, looking like he's no different from a raw recruit. At this stage, the so-called tactics of both Germany and France have devolved into simply using sheer numbers to crush the opposition. Facing a wall of dense enemy fire, countless warriors are cut down in an instant, and now the air is thick, not just with smoke, but with a fine crimson mist. After finally breaking through the enemy's wall of lead, the German troops storm into the opposing trenches. The close-quarters combat is incredibly gory, and every single man has to fight with every ounce of strength he has. Kat and Tjaden stumble upon a kitchen filled with the very food they've been craving most. As Paul passes by, he's just as cold and hungry, so he joins them in the feast. But just as the three of them are shoveling food into their mouths, a rhythmic thundering begins to shake the trench from above. By the time Kat and the others scramble out, their comrades have already set up machine guns and started spraying. After several rounds of shelling, massive tanks begin to emerge from the rolling fog. The intense firepower leaves no room for thought, and they can only watch helplessly as these behemoths steadily close the distance. Everyone is putting out as much fire as they can, yet they have no idea just how devastating these tanks truly are. This weapon was a British invention, and ever since it was first deployed on the Western Front in September 1916, the original balance of power between the two sides has been completely shattered. Watching the smoke-filled battlefield from thousands of meters away, the German general casually puffs on a cigar. Paul retreats along with the main force, watching as the ground they just bled to take is snatched right back. In comparison, the French equipment and weaponry are light years ahead, leaving the German army with almost no way to resist. Albert hides behind a wrecked tank, But just as he tries to make a break for it, he's caught in the open. With zero hesitation or mercy, the enemy unalives him by burning him alive right then and there. Paul sees this tragedy unfold clearly from not far away, but he's forced to be a witness to the horror with no way to help. Quickly retreating to their original trench, Paul grabs a bucket and starts gulping down water. Afterward, he screams out Franz's name, terrified that he's about to lose his very last friend. However, the situation is dire and gives them no time to think, so everyone grabs their gear and continues the retreat. The defeated German troops scatter in every direction, as their strength is simply no match for the enemy's onslaught. The French haven't just deployed ground tanks, but also fighter planes that are constantly raining down bombs. While fleeing in the chaos, Paul accidentally slips and falls into a water-filled crater. He tries to climb out, but it's no use, as the slippery walls keep him trapped in the mud. Paul's original plan is to play dead to survive, but at that moment, an enemy soldier stops right behind him. Luckily, a nearby shell blast throws off the soldier's aim, giving Paul a split-second window of opportunity. He takes his dagger and frantically stabs the man until his opponent has no strength left to fight back. With enemy troops now on both sides, a desperate Paul remains trapped in the crater. At this point, the dying soldier seems to be crying out for help, and a spark of humanity leads Paul to crawl over to him. He pulls out a handkerchief to try and stop the bleeding, but just as he applies pressure, he realizes the man has already passed away. The man dies with his eyes wide open to the sky, as if he's lodging a final, silent protest against this cursed war. This brutal scene fills Paul with a crushing sense of guilt, and while whispering, "I'm sorry," he pulls out a notebook that was poking out of the man's uniform. Inside, he finds a family photo and a soldier's ID with his personal information. Paul mutters to himself, promising that after the war, he will definitely go and visit the man's family. If it weren't for this war, none of them would have ever become enemies. Meanwhile, the German representatives are sitting down to a meal of bread. They've taken a train to the border of Germany and France, where the upcoming ceasefire agreement is set to be signed. As evening falls, Paul walks out of the battlefield, his face a mask of exhaustion amidst the smell of blood and scorched earth. Back at the main camp, news of the armistice has already spread, and everyone is celebrating the fact that the war is finally over. Yet, no one could have guessed that the darkest hour before the dawn was about to arrive. Paul tries to find Franz in the crowd, but even after searching the entire camp, there is no sign of him. Unknowingly, he ends up at the infirmary, which is overflowing with soldiers who have suffered horrific injuries. Because there isn't enough anesthesia to go around, amputations are performed by having the wounded bite down on gauze, while a bone saw does the work. Following the sound of a voice, Paul finally spots Jodin, who is lying on the ground clinging to life, his mangled legs completely destroyed. Jodin is despondent, lamenting that his dream of becoming a village policeman is officially over. Paul tries to comfort him, saying the war is ending and they should just be grateful they survived. At that moment, Jodin hands over Franz's silk scarf, a silent confirmation that Paul's last friend is dead. Paul walks out of the room feeling aimless, his chest tight with a hollow sense of loss as he wraps the scarf around his neck and goes to look for Kat. The second Kat sees the scarf, he knows exactly what happened. Later, the two of them snag an extra serving of dinner and find Jodin, with Paul handing him a set of utensils. By now, Jodin is staring blankly, his spirit completely broken, likely because the physical pain has become too much to bear. While Kat and Paul are distracted by their meal, Jodin suddenly plunges a fork into his own throat, clearly unwilling to live through any more of this. Perhaps it was the clash between his dreams and his new reality that pushed Jodin to such an extreme, as he uses his own method to end his fate. Ironically, while Paul and Kat are mourning their friend, another wounded soldier nearby simply swipes Jodin's food. Humanity can be warm, but it can also be incredibly cold. What war leaves behind, besides physical agony, is a far more lethal destruction of the soul. That night, Kat releases his beetle, hoping it finds a better place to belong. Paul notices that the French soldier's belongings have gone missing, and a sudden wave of grief washes over him as he feels like life has lost all its meaning. Kat comforts Paul, telling him that the living must carry on the hopes of those who have passed, and that this is the ultimate meaning of life. Clutching Franz's scarf, Paul slowly lays down to rest. At the same time, the peace negotiations on the train proceed as scheduled. Germany and France engage in a fierce debate, finally reaching a consensus to sign the armistice. From the moment the pens touch the paper, the ceasefire between the two nations is set to officially begin at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. The news travels fast to both camps, and soldiers begin firing their guns into the air in celebration. However, the German general is absolutely livid, cursing the government as incompetent for choosing to compromise so easily. Once the night passes, the entire camp becomes strangely quiet, as if every soldier has dropped their guard against the enemy. Kat listens to the armistice announcement on the radio, finally convinced that the brutal war is over. He then calls on Paul, deciding they should go steal one last goose. On the way, they talk about their plans for after the war, and while Paul has no clue what to do, Kat insists he must go back to school, because only an education can guarantee a future. As they talk, they arrive back at the same farmhouse from before. This time, it's Paul's turn to go inside while Kat stays back to keep watch. Snow begins to fall softly, perfectly matching the newfound silence of the world. A gunshot sends Paul running out, as he has predictably been discovered. The farmer's aim is still terrible, but the seeds of hatred have already been planted in the heart of a young child. Even though Paul didn't manage to get the goose, he did snag a few eggs. Since a few broke while they were running, they simply eat them right there on the spot. Afterward, Kat heads into the nearby woods to relieve himself. However, that one mistake is exactly what seals his fate. Out of nowhere, the farmer's young son appears behind him and shoots him point blank. Hearing the shot, Paul senses something is wrong and instinctively assumes there might be deserters in the woods. Kat looks like he's okay at first, explaining what happened and noting that he doesn't hold it against the kid. But after taking only a few steps, he collapses. That single shot had hit him right in the abdomen. Paul is worried, but Kat brushes it off as if it's nothing. On the way back, they encounter a truck heading for the camp. But no matter how hard Paul shouts, not a single driver is willing to give them a lift. By now, Kat has slipped into a coma, leaving Paul with no choice but to carry him on his back. By the time they finally scramble back to the camp, most of the day has already passed. As soon as Paul sets Kat down, a doctor rushes over to examine the wound. After a quick check, the doctor announces that Kat is dead, having bled out internally as the infection from the dark blood caused his liver to fail. Paul can't bring himself to believe that Kat is gone, but the facts are the facts. The war is over, and every single one of his close friends is dead. Outside, his comrades are cheering about going home, while Paul sits alone in a room mourning his friends. Later, they drag their exhausted bodies to the command center, where the general is about to issue one final order. Right then, they happen to pass some fresh recruits who have no idea what's coming next. The general stands high above them, delivering a final, furious speech. He loathes the incompetent government, blaming them for letting countless soldiers bleed and sacrifice their lives, only to bring the entire war to such a half-baked and hasty conclusion. In his eyes, if they return home like this, they'll be nothing more than cowards who accepted defeat. With only 30 minutes left until the ceasefire, the general orders every soldier to make one final stand. This announcement is impossible for the men to accept. Some veterans flat out refuse to fight, but they are met with immediate execution. Orders are orders, and Paul is forced to follow the main force back onto the battlefield. Nobody cares whether they live or die, except for the men themselves. A little over 10 minutes later, the very last of the German forces reach the front line. Facing the abyss of the battlefield, a final 15-minute slaughter is about to begin. Every man's face is grim and resigned, as they've become numb to the value of their own lives. No one knows which soldier starts running first, but soon the rest of the pack is forced into the rhythm. At the same moment, the unsuspecting French are still celebrating, but an officer soon senses something is wrong. With a single command, the enemy's firepower roars back to life, and the shadow of death instantly covers everyone. It's the same charge through a hail of bullets, the same desperate sprint, and at this moment, Paul is fearless, seemingly forgetting that the end is only minutes away. In a critical moment, Paul saves a new recruit. With no time to reload, he jumps into a trench and intercepts another enemy. Since he's out of ammo, Paul ends up in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle with a French soldier, while the terrified recruit just stands there watching in a daze. In a scramble for a pistol on the ground, Paul and the French soldier tumble into a cellar. The two of them quickly scramble to their feet and lock eyes, falling into a tense standoff, but right at that very moment. In the end, Paul ultimately fails to hold out until 11 o'clock. He uses every bit of strength he has left to shakily walk back outside. The light before him is warm and bright, a clear sign that the peace agreement has finally taken effect. With just a few short steps, Paul burns through the last of his energy. The air is still thick with smoke, but the scent of death has finally vanished. The entire front is silent, with the German and French troops standing peacefully as if the battle from 15 minutes ago never happened. No one truly hates anyone else. They were all just carrying out their final duties of patriotic fervor. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, Paul dies. The 4-year war between Germany and France is finally over. A short while later, an officer walks over and hands a bag to the new recruit, ordering him to collect the dog tags of the fallen. He peels back the uniforms of the dead to retrieve their symbols of identity. When the recruit stands up again, he sees a familiar silhouette. It was this veteran who saved his life. Paul looks peaceful in death, and looking at the big picture, this might have been the end he wanted most. The recruit takes Franz's silk scarf from Paul's hand and wraps it around his own neck. And so, the film concludes on a quiet shot of Paul. From October 1914 to November 1918, the Western Front was locked in a stalemate of trench warfare, with the front line barely moving by the time the war ended. Over 3 million soldiers lost their lives here, often fighting just to advance a few hundred meters. Paul and his friends witnessed hunger, gore, and death, as the absurdity of war crushed their sense of heroism and robbed them of their traditional values and faith. Ultimately, the meaning of peace remains the highest pursuit for any nation.